You're about to watch a tutorial on how not to install shocks. I kind of did about everything wrong that you could do wrong. First of all, you're going to want to leave those wires on there to keep the shocks compressed. I recommend adding your own wire so you can adjust the length. The last thing you want to do is strip out the threads in that top lug that's connected to the frame of the car. So I recommend you start that bolt first. Then you adjust your length and you pound in the bottom. If you happen to ruin those, it's just a nut and a bolt and you could fix that. Got a 2005 Chrysler Town Country minivan, 3.8 liter touring package. Today we're going to replace the rear shock absorbers. I'm eventually going to replace the front struts. But for tonight, we're just installing these Gabriel shock absorbers. You want to get one side of the car, or both, safely supported on some jack stands. That lower nut's pretty easy to get to. This upper one doesn't look bad. We'll start with getting a screwdriver in here. We'll pry this little cover off, pull the lug nuts, get this tire off there. That top bolt and the bottom bolt are 18 millimeter. The top one basically goes into a nut that's fastened to the frame. On the bottom, that's 18 millimeter. On the bottom, you'll need to hold the bolt on one side and undo the nut on this side. You might not believe it, but actually using an extension, especially this big long one, takes away a lot of torque. So I'm going to see if I can get this on there without the extension. And I can't. So I'm going to grab my breaker bar. Alright, I got a piece of pipe holding that wrench steady on the other side and a 25-inch breaker bar on the end of this extension, so we'll break that loose. That bolt out of there. Okay, now we'll focus our attention on the top. We'll go with the 18 millimeter socket, extension, and a 25-inch breaker bar. Nothing to that one. Wasn't very tight. That shock is loose. We'll lay the shocks on the ground side by side. The new one is physically larger in diameter, but I believe I read that in some of the reviews. The length will stretch out as soon as we take some side cutters and snip this wire they've got that squeezes them together. Verified that the two bolts fit in and look right. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that wire on there to squeeze it together. I'm going to put the top one in first. I always like anti-seize, so I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on both of the bolts. Not much, just a little. Go ahead and get the shock up in there. Get it started in that hole. Got a lot of turns out of it, so I know it's in good shape. Pretty much all the way in by hand. with the wires still on. When I swing the other one over, we're going to come up just a freckle short. So we'll have to cut these wires. That'll let this thing start to come out. We'll slip that bolt in there, tighten her up. We'll go ahead and take some side cutters, cut this wire. Starts to grow pretty fast here. I have to force it back up in there by hand, which is a bit of a battle. Of course, it doesn't want to quite slide in the slot, and the whole time it's fighting you. Here's tip number one. If you're silly enough to take that wire off, find yourself some baling wire, squeeze it together, get it about the right length. Okay, just remember that wire is your best friend. You're going to get mighty tired of trying to squeeze that thing, get those bolts lined up. So use that wire to adjust the length, or perhaps raise and lower the axle to help things line up, but do not just cut those wires off. If you do, I put some baling wire back on there, and then I was able to adjust the length and get it exactly right, and then put it together. Okay, don't take my word for it on this. I don't know what the torque specs are. This bottom one was fairly easy to get tight. This is my favorite wrench. You know, just give it about as good as I can give it without going crazy. Same with the top. Looks good. I actually took a torque wrench. This top one felt a little funny to me. When I took it off, I said, you know, it wasn't very tight. So I kind of tightened it. Then I kept bumping the torque up or down until I finally found right about 65 felt good on that one, and probably closer to 80 on this bottom one. Now that you got everything tight, you can take your baling wire off, get it out of the way. We're going to do side number 2. This time we're going to be a little smarter. We'll start out the same way. We put a wrench on the bolt head back there, got a little pipe to hold the wrench steady, got my big breaker bar on there. We'll snap that nut loose, then we'll go in up here, get that nut loose, that bolt actually, and that bolt, it's not real tight. I'm going to look, I think it's fine threaded, and when I was tightening it last time, it just had that scary feeling like it was going to strip, so that's why I quit at about 65-70 foot-pounds. Well, this top bolt is not really fine threaded, but it sure has a spongy feeling on it, so I'm not going to go above about 65 foot-pounds on it. What we're going to be smart about this time is we're going to leave that wire on there. I'm going to add my own wire that I can custom make the length once I get it into place. Got both that top and bottom one out. Work that shock out of there. We've got the new one here. In case you can't figure it out, there are some instructions on here that tell you that there's an arrow pointing this way, that this is the top. So the outer shell goes on top. I stuck the shock up in there with the factory wire still on it, and it looked like it was going to be a little short. So I put my wire on there with just a little slack. We'll get it up into position. We'll cut the factory wire, and then that'll let it stretch out to the proper length. You just want to be real careful with this top bolt that you don't cross thread it. I didn't like the way that it felt, so I took it out, took it over to the wire brush, cleaned the bolt off, screwed it in. There was a little rough spot, got it past that, now it feels smooth, so I'm going to try again. You want to be sure that you're not cross-threaded in there. So pull down on the shock, make sure you can get a few turns by hand, go ahead and tighten her all the way in there. Got that bottom bolt in with the nut on it. You kind of have to just tap that lightly. You might need a small hammer to tap that up in place. wiggle it around, get one side in, get the bolt started, wiggle it around, get the bolt through, put the nut on it. Again, I don't know the torque spec. I'm going with about 65 on the top, about 80 on the bottom. And basically put the tire and wheel back on. Get your first get your homemade wire off of there. Get everything tight. Get your tire, wheel back on. You're done. Got everything installed and torqued down. Got all the wires off. Now's a great time to check your brake pads. See how much padding you got in there. We'll go ahead and put the tire and wheel on, torque those lug nuts down, get the car down, we'll be done. You always want to make sure you start all lug nuts by hand to get several turns out of them. Then take them on in, get them fairly snug, set the car down, torque them to spec. The old shocks are pretty crusty, but they still got some good cushion spring to them. They're not leaking any oil. 122,000 miles on the car, so factory ones made it that long.